Hey guys, welcome back to our castle painting masterclass. This is a part 3 of our 4-part series on painting castles and historic landmarks. So last week we focused a lot on kind of the lighting conditions and bringing out the mood of our subject. But today's class is all about composition and about bringing the castle subject back into their surroundings and kind of develop a tasteful angle of depicting them, and to avoid kind of repetition, symmetry, and boredom, but instead trying to find intrigue and storytelling. All right, without further ado, let's take a look. Why is composition important? Well, this is what happened when you are approaching the castle and you just got so excited and you snap a photo of it without thinking. You know, although the castle is marvelous in the background, you're really not composing your image, right? It doesn't have a wide tonal range. Everything is kind of the same value range, and the foreground is blending even with the background object. So this is why we want to talk about composition. Now, composition itself is like a topic you can really spend hours and multiple classes on. But for the purpose of painting castles, which is an architectural object with natural surroundings usually, I want to really primarily focus on 3 areas. The first is about achieving a wide and balanced tonal range. The second is about creating movement, rhythm, and a bit of unexpectedness. The third is kind of choosing that angle to depict the castle and what kind of surroundings to include versus not include. Cool, let's take a look at the first topic, achieving a wide and balanced tonal range. So what do I mean by that is we can start looking at some examples here. Now this one, the famous Belfast Castle, it actually is not a good tonal range. Why? Because the sun is kind of hitting the castle like from this angle up front, right? So the shadows you see here are really minimal. And then from that light tone, which makes up for the majority of this composition, kind of jump right into a dark tone, which are these bushes and foliages. There's really not enough mid-tone range. If we were to draw this one out, yeah, so this one you will see that it kind of really doesn't have a lot of 3-dimensionality of the castle. If you paint it based on this photo, the castle takes up a big space as well. The sky is gonna be light, this wall is light, all the castles are light, and there's just not enough mid-tone to kind of create that strong 3-dimensionality. So I wouldn't recommend kind of painting this castle with this giant shape. So when we compare that photo to this photo in particular, this one's actually got a much healthier tonal range. The only difference is that this particular angle of the architecture, the building turned 90 degrees, allowing the shadow part to show up just as much as the sunlit part of the castle. So that it has the light tonal range on this building, it has the mid-range on this shadow wall, including the casting shadow on the ground. It also has, these darker ranges for the windows, but also these bushes, and some of the darker tones are on the figure as well. So this has a much healthier range in terms of light, mid, and dark tones. Not to say the equal amount, but I think the mid-tone is really important, like to have that, mid-tone value range, maybe like 50% of the painting. Dark tone, you wanted to keep it kind of like a minimal, maybe unless you're painting a nocturnal scene, but it has the light, mid, and dark in a healthy proportion. Now this photo to me has got even something more special and more interesting to paint, because not only, the main architecture feature, right, of this front building and the towers, half lit, half dark position to the sun. So you can really paint a lot of interesting shapes between, the light and dark. But also this part of the shadow, right? Even though you see mostly like these flat and triangular roof lines for the shaded part of the building, they're not all one-dimensional. There are these bushes, right? That can give me an idea as an artist. It's like, oh, these bushes and this little wall that's slightly more lit than the others, those are going to create really interesting disruptions and places for the eyes to land on. And also when the viewers approach the scene, you know, they probably see this very bright green patch of grass that's going to actually lead their eyes onto these buildings here. But then because there are casted shadow, your eyes started moving towards the shaded part of the building, where it can actually, you know, bounce around and look at these interesting details of these backlit foliages. So really think about like the eye movement when someone approached the painting. So they have more to look at. It doesn't just kind of exit the painting after they take an initial look. So this to me is a much kind of healthier version, right, of the tonal range. And these buildings all serve a role in terms of moving your eyes across the painting with some, you know, high contrast areas here and there to look at. So yeah, this to me is a much more interesting tonal range, but also, you know, eye movement. So that's our first topic, you know, striving for a balanced tonal range. The next area I want to address regarding composition, I want to talk about the movement, right, and the rhythm you're creating, kind of the shapes and their tensions in the composition. But before that, a real quick announcement. If you're ready to take your art practice to the next level, or you simply would like to support me for my ongoing effort of producing high quality learning content, then I also have a Patreon membership program for you to check out. As a member, you'll be able to attend online painting workshops every month, joining on Q&A live sessions and discussions, as well as receiving individualized critique and feedback from me. You will also get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content where I will show my work in progress, as well as talking about other aspects of being an artist. All right, back to the main topic. It's very easily to fall into this trap when you're painting castles, right? This is what pops in our mind when you think about castle. It's very symmetrical, it's majestic looking, and especially like a lot of geometry and symmetry that plays out. And that's what creates grandeur in, you know, architecture and in real life. But when you're painting it, this creates boredom, right? So if this one, you turn that into a painting, the viewer is gonna kind of follow this front path and their eyes land on the front door, but really doesn't have any particular way to go. Like, they may look left and right, but what they see is very identical. Now here's the second example. This is getting better. I would say like there's still a certain amount of symmetry happening with this entrance. It's a beautiful kind of Baroque style facade. Great. But the thing about, you know, facade is like if it's just a facade, it's not as interesting. But luckily in this composition, now the photographer gave me an idea by including, right, some of these side buildings into the view, and potentially there is a casted shadow at the lower right corner. And this building that's butting against the main building is not symmetrical. So for me, this painting will be way more interesting, and the tonal range will also be more balanced if we say we actually are going to crop this tower out. This building will be cropped out, so there's no way for this building to create symmetry for us, right? And the floor is actually slanting this way, which is very interesting. I want to exaggerate that because that can create movement. And of course, this building here is super interesting shaped. That's next to it. This middle one is just magnificent, highly symmetrical, but not helpful as a painting subject. But what will be really interesting is when we include this building. Maybe add a bit of different roof lines here into our composition, and there will be people here. There may be some more cast a shadow here. So then now we can make everything more interesting by saying here is the tonal range wise, right? For the mid-tone, it will be casting underneath this roof line, be underneath this roof line. Some details, it's very small mid-tone combined with this large mid-tone and this mid-tone on the ground, which are the casting shadows. This building will have a mid-tone, This building's roof will be mid-tone as well because it's a darker colored roof, right? These buildings in the background, maybe, I feel like if they got moved over here, it might be more interesting. So yeah, I'm not sure, especially because what this building does, it doesn't really add much other than kind of it's the same tonal range too, to the front building. And because again, this is the sun hitting the front, which we learned, sometimes it's actually not helpful from a painting purpose. It's like dimensionality got flattened out. Yeah, maybe we don't want the towel so obvious. We can maybe hide it and make it smaller in the background and just use a lower contrast method. And the shadows casting by these people, the side lit, right, will be really helpful to connect to actually some of the details on the building. And potentially there will be darker tones on this building. This to me is a more interesting rhythm, right? It allows us to really pay attention to the architecture details here because they're not repeated. You enter kind of from this way with the shadow leading you towards the composition and your eyes land on this building. You can circling around this building because there are shape connecting to other shapes, including these like, shadows of the people figure. Moved upwards, can look at different details coming downwards here this way. And even though in the larger mid-tone shape, there can be other, smaller details to look at. So it kind of like become a circular motion. It's kind of like this shape, right? So that's just more interesting and creates more dynamics. Now, this is an interesting example. Where again in photo it's beautiful, but because the shape of the castle is quite simplistic, including the shape of the shadows, and also the castle again make up for like 70–80% of the composition, that's why when you turn that into a painting, it actually looks less exciting. It's still very stable. We can shrink down the castle versus it kind of makes up for the entire painting. We can move it maybe a little bit to the right. In the composition, everybody talks about the rule of thirds, so like maybe shift it a bit to the right. But what I really like about this photo is that it gives me an idea that I can actually create some foliage. So that's like the foreground. Foregrounds sometimes are actually really helpful. By creating the foreground, it kind of creates more dimensionality and it frames the subject. So it's not just like a rectangle shape to look at. It creates some movement for the eye, although not much. But what's more importantly is that, we can also add some background maybe to this subject. So when it's all added up, there's actually more dimensionality and depth to look at. I'm pretty sure this is a Baroque style castle. Like these big lines of the casted shadow created by these domes is really the motif if we were to paint this. Even that little square of a light between these large shapes, that's absolutely something we want to preserve. Because the contrast comes from, like, again, large and small shapes. If it's all the same size, it's boring. But again, if we were to add some foliage here, I don't mind like the bottom of this castle getting cropped out because you actually don't need to see the entire what's there. It's just the same repetition of the same shape, right? So add some foliage here so that the viewer's attention will be slowed down, right? They kind of have to do this versus boom right there. Now, here's the beauty is we can start adding some background as well. And what's really a missed opportunity too with this castle is this beautiful reflection, right? By shifting it to the right and moving it up a little, that's where reflection becomes part of the story. So we will have these shape created by the shadow part of the castle. So yeah, so in terms of darkest tone, it's actually on these, right, on these foliages. Adding this foliage again, like adding the tonal range we talked about, because the overall castle is so brightly lit in the distance. I don't want to maybe introduce too much dark tone on the castle itself. That's how also we can add interest to a relatively kind of one-dimensional subject. So here's another photo I want to show you is, again, like how cropping can really help you, especially with some of these more repetitive and symmetrical castles, is that, you know, you can choose to paint a vignette, right? Like the close-up shot of the photo that you take, as versus, you know, having to include the entirety of the castle, because it's trying to create depth with the subject itself. So your eye movement can follow this, you know, perspective line to go back and forth, right, in the different depth, where these like lily pads in the water also helps, you know, viewers move their attention around. And there is the beautiful, like high contrasted area in the reflection. That's all going to aid to creating that rhythm and movement for our composition. So yeah, let's try this composition then. You also avoid like repetition, even though these two towers are identical, you're not choosing to depict them as exactly the same. You create one small, one large, right, with the dimensionality. And the contrast of this tower with the sky inside the reflection, again, is very helpful. Have some foliage here. You may want to simplify this, because sometimes this foliage can be quite messy. All these lily pond is kind of, you know, directing the viewer's attention, but also to kind of slow you down a little bit here and there. So your eyes can kind of meander in through this reflection areas versus just kind of cut to the chase. So in terms of mid-tone, we have, again, the main building's roof. The reflection can be, you know, more simplified as meaning that the contrast between like the light and dark doesn't need to be as high as the building itself. Ideally, there's like a gradation here, you know, towards the top of the reflection can be a bit darker. Yeah, so that would just make the composition more further interesting. Probably this mid-tone can be a bit darker. And then there is these like small little sunlit triangles in the dark. That's absolutely beautiful. I wouldn't leave them out if I were to paint that. Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is the surroundings of the castle, whether or not to include those and how much of that to include, as well as the angle of the castle, right? This one, for example, that's how human experience a lot of these castles. And we're on the ground level and looking up to the castle up on the hill, which I think is a totally viable way to depict castle. The only issue I see with this type of angle is that there's like quite a bit of foreground, right? And the foreground is kind of boring, doesn't have a lot of detail, but if you try to pay attention to painting the foreground, you might detract someone's attention from the castle. So here we have the same subject, the Edinburgh Castle, but to me this is a more interesting photo because there are foreground, right, of the buildings. And the castle is kind of that, looming object in the distance. and behind that there is the city landscapes with the hills. So I would say it's totally okay, even though, you know, your subject is actually about this castle, to not depict that as your focal point, right? What I mean is that, like, yeah, the shapes of these buildings at the front that's leading up to the castle, you know, it can be a bit more elaborate than the castle itself, but the painting is still about the castle because how grand in scale in comparison to the other, you know, subjects in the scene. Now here's another example. You see what I mean? Like, even though the photo is not about, well, the photo is actually is about the, well, the photo is actually about the St. Vitus Cathedral, isn't it? So yeah, the cathedral is in the background, and the contrast is even lower than the bridge and the buildings in the foreground. And it's okay to do that and adding a bit of atmosphere when you depict the castle and intentionally lower the contrast. But it is the most magnificent thing in the picture, right? So yeah, when you're crafting your composition, like, you don't have to be, you know, leaving everything out and only paint the castle itself. So when I was visiting a lot of the castles in Bavaria, Germany, this one is absolutely my favorite. It's the Liechtenstein. This one, because you really can see the surroundings, the commanding view from the castle, it just made everything much more interesting, and the location is much more unique, where you get to depict not only the castle, but this cliff it's built upon, with that sweeping view of the cities that even is, you know, in depth stretching into the valley behind. Actually, in next class, we're going to demo painting this scene from beginning to end. If you're interested, stay tuned. And here is another approach that I think will really work well for castles, especially castles built upon a cliff and is like in a ruins form. This one, for example, you just don't know where, like, the nature ends and where the castle begins. And that's the beauty of the site. So don't need to worry about depicting the castle itself. Like, just integrate that, right, into the landscape. This is another good example where, you know, built upon such a homogeneous landscape, and this castle kind of disrupts that straight line and created this interesting shape in the middle of it. So that's another really good example. A lot of the castles have the water features surrounding it, and that's absolutely something we want to take advantage of. So for me, this painting, it's currently interesting because of all of the reflections, but also the hard edge of the building contrasting with the soft edges of the foliage. But to me, you can totally paint this painting just by focusing on the reflection, and the water lilies actually play an interesting dynamics with the reflection itself, creating a sharp edge as versus soft edge. In today's class, we looked at so many helpful examples of composing the scene and trying our hands and doing some thumbnail sketches to see different ways of cropping the image or bringing out the characteristics of the subject. So next week's class, we're going to do an actual painting of the Liechtenstein Castle, and I'll be taking you guys through the full process, meaning it's not just painting the final piece, but actually composing. Try it out, feel it out, make adjustment, and then apply the insights from our sketching process to the final painting to make it more successful. All right, I hope to see you all again in next week's class. Bye.